So hello everybody, I am Gwen Lafleur and coming to you live from Artistic Artifacts in Alexandria, Virginia. And I am excited today to get to come and share with you some techniques for making your own embossing powder seals. And I'll show you, we'll peek over here at these a little bit. These are some of the samples. I made a lot, went a little bit crazy because they're a lot of fun. But I just have seen how wax seals have started to make this huge resurgence in the craft world. And they're beautiful. I love them. I love how they work, except that requires that you buy a whole other set of tools. So you have to buy the seals, you have to buy the wax, and all of the other things that go with it, which is great, but it takes up more space, and you have to have, you buy all separate things. And so I thought, why not see if I could make my own with embossing powder? Because you can, that's the idea of doing these types of things has been around for years and years, but I wanted to put my own spin on it and then share a couple of different ways that I've found that makes them work. So I am gonna go ahead and dive right in. I know we've probably got people just barely joining and getting in, but wanna get started and get moving, and we'll be archived so everybody can watch later and catch up in case you come in late and miss it. But I'm gonna show you two ways to make these. And I'll go over first just the supplies that I've used so you can see some of the samples and the different ways, the different kinds that I've done, the different colors. You can use whatever embossing powder you want. Some blend and reheat better than others. I'm going to be using my Boho Blends embossing powders from Emerald Creek. And I'm gonna use some of the translucent ones and the opaque, and we're gonna mix them together. And I'll show you two ways to do that. And then I want to also show how you can use your embossing powder to create marbled effects and turn those into seals as well. You can stamp into them, or you could use them as embellishment layers or just embellishments on their own. I think they're really cool and beautiful. And it's probably hard to see, you get a glare because they're glossy, but hopefully you can see what a cool effect that is. So let's start with the supplies, and I'm going to show you the first and probably the most common way to make the embossing powder seals. It's like an embossing powder skin, which is a technique that's out there and that a lot of you have probably seen, but it's a little bit more concentrated, and we're going to thicken it up and make it so that it's something you can peel off and use as an embellishment. So to start, you need embossing powder, obviously. I've got a little tray here of some of the ones that I picked out for mine. And then you just need some kind of an embossing ink. I'm going to use the Versa marker, the Tsukaneko Versamark ink in a marker form, but you can use just an ink pad and rub it on your mat. And then of course I have a craft mat, and I've got my heat gun. And for the seals, it'll work on a craft mat, but I find that what works really well is to just get some parchment paper. And you can buy this, it's a baking supply. You can get rolls of parchment paper. I buy these pre-cut sheets. I think they're meant to use to package cookies or something, but I'm gonna put that on top of the Teflon mat. And then I'm just gonna take and get started. I wanna get everything ready to go before I go in here. So let's see, I'm gonna start with my topaz. And I want to get them open and ready to go. This is a translucent, and let's pick out a couple things because I like to blend. Let's pick out a couple that will mix into it. I'm gonna do my saffron, and I want to get out my Turkish bronze, which is fun to mix into pretty much everything, so that's gonna be probably left out. And then I've got a little spoon. This is one that you could just use a plastic spoon or whatever you've got laying around. I like to have the cool tools, so got this and I'm gonna use it. So you wanna have everything ready. I do also have a pair of copper tongs. I like to use these to hold things in place when I'm embossing because they don't conduct heat. So when I touch them, it's not gonna burn me, and it'll help me to kind of control and manipulate everything. And then of course I've got my rubber stamps. I brought just a few sets with me. I have 21 sets available now from Paper Artsy, but these are the ones that I've brought. But you can really use anything. I've focused on the circular elements with the seal theme in mind, but we'll go ahead and I'll pull one out here and get that ready to go. And the other thing that you're gonna want to do is have an ink pad ready. You don't have to have an ink pad, but it really is gonna help to define the design. Oh, and that one is losing its stick a little because I use it so much. So what I like to do is just, this is a black, you can use whatever ink you want for this, but I like the archival inks. I like to get it all inked up, and then I leave it there and just put the cap kind of sitting there so that it's out of the way, but it's ready so that I can grab it quickly, because that's important. So I've got my pen, but like I said, you can just use your ink pad. I like the pen because it can give me that circle shape. It's a little bit more controlled. And you're not really going to be able to see this except for maybe the glare. I'm just drawing a circle with the ink and trying as best I can to get it filled in. Okay, and then set that aside. And then, oh, I should have brought myself a tray, but I'll just use another paper. I'm just going to pour that first layer of embossing powder. Actually, I don't really need that. And you can see mine have been well used, and so there's a lot of junk that's mixed in with them. That's actually from a previous seal. I'll just make sure I got that covered and get that shaken off. So we're ready. Now I want to have that close at hand and have my spoon ready, because this is where we're going to start to build layers. And because you may not hear me well once I get the heat gun going, I'm probably going to do in total 8 to 10 layers of embossing powder, because we want to get it thick enough that it's something that you can peel and handle and use. Okay, so here we go. Just gonna go ahead and get this melting. And what I do like about these powders is they melt a little bit faster than some of the ones on the market. And if you're using a different brand, I would just play with it and see how well they take the remelting. Some do it really, really well and some don't. The first layer takes the longest, and you just want to get to the point where it's kind of molten looking. And it's going to be spotty at first, especially because I'm working on this parchment paper that has some natural resist. And then I'm going to move the heat gun, and I'm just going to sprinkle. And I'm going to wait a second because I want to let it start to melt in, and it's going to blow. It's just going to blow a little bit. And I'm going to repeat, and I'm going to, hold on, change hands here because I'm a lefty and that's going to get awkward. And keep that hot and then sprinkle. And I'm trying to do light layers to minimize how much blows off. And then this is where a nice pair of tongs will hold it in place while you're working with 2 hands.
So someone said I would be afraid to have an open jar of powder that close to my heat gun.
It's okay as long as you're not directing the heat straight at it. I do this all the time and have yet to even melt one. But yeah, don't get too close to it. If it's in the line of heat of your heat gun, that could be problematic. Now you see how this is starting to get thick? What we're looking for is where it starts to have this movement. Okay, and this is a translucent powder, but you can see that as it gets thicker and thicker, it's going to become more opaque. Now I'm getting to where I can add in some other colors. So this is a little saffron. You can see how that melts in. And you can use your heat gun to sort of spread that out and move it around. And you can do just a single color. I like to blend it up. And then I'm going to put in that bronze. And then I'll hit it with a little bit more topaz. Because it's a translucent, it's not going to cover up as much as an opaque would. But, okay, now we're getting nice and thick. So I'm going to keep the heat on it while I get my stamp ready. You want rubber, red rubber for this, not polymer. And I'm going to stamp right into the middle of it. That was a pretty big lake of it, so I could probably have gone with a smaller stamp. And then you want to peel off. Now, this gets tricky. Okay, you want to, if you're doing a wax seal, you usually let it sit until it dries and then pull it out. This, you want to start to pull them out pretty quickly. If they do this where they don't release, don't worry about it. Just go ahead. I rub it to make sure that it sticks. And then I'm going to peel it off. Okay. I'm going to peel this back. If this happens, sometimes they just release really easily, and sometimes they don't. I find the thicker that I get the embossing powder, the more likely it is that I have to go through this process. I'm just going to very carefully release. Okay. Now, doing it this way, is the most brittle approach. Okay, and that one I lost a little bit in here, which I didn't get it thick enough in that part. And you can see I didn't get it totally thick enough. But now, while it's still a little bit warm to the touch, if you want it to look more like a seal, you can hear that it's crackling because it's already cooling. I'm going to cut it so that it looks a little bit more circular. So there I have one. These you can take, you can put them in a little box or something. You can remelt those later. You can reuse them. And then when they're cool, I usually do this with StazOn, which I didn't bring with me, but you can hit them, not totally cool, because the cooler they are, the more brittle they are. You can hit them with an ink pad and you can ink the edges a little bit. They're going to break. That is the downside of doing this particular method. They are extremely brittle and they're going to crack. And what I'm going to show you is that you can fix it with one of your best friends' masking tape. And so I brought some with me. There is no shame in throwing a little masking tape on the back of your wax seal. Nobody's going to see it. It's going to help provide a little extra structure. If it's nice and solid and it's not cracking on you, that's fine. But and you don't need to do it. But I find that this particular method is going to require a little bit of help on the back side. So I'll leave that like
you have
that
a
for
question?
now. Yep, go for it.
Is releasing it harder to do if you were using a wood-mounted rubber stamp?
Yes, but it's possible. It really just, sometimes I forget and I leave the mount on here. And what it's really going to require is that you're holding it like that and pretending like this is wood. You just have to be a little bit more careful. You need to work a little more quickly because this is going to get brittle. And you need to just get your fingernails in there or something sharp, an awl, the tip of an awl or a needle, and pull it out. And you just have to be more careful because you don't have the flexibility that you get when you can take the backing off of the stamp. But it's possible, you can do it. But I'm going to show you another method that will make things a little bit easier and it's going to make your seals a little bit more durable. This is the quick method. It's kind of a quick and dirty. I need one now and I'm just going to glue it to something so I don't care if it's brittle. But I'm going to show you one that if you've got a little more time and preparation, it's going to work a little better and give you a little bit more flexible and durable faux wax seal or embossing powder seal. So that is the embossing ink method. You can go much, much thicker on this if you would like to. You can see I really went too thin and it shows because it spread too much and then it got thin in the middle. But are there any questions on this particular method before I go on to the second one? Because the second one's really my favorite, so. Good?
No
Good?
questions, but you've got lots of followers. You've got someone signed in from France. We've got UK, Arizona, Wisconsin.
Hello. I'm so glad everybody joined in from all over the place. It's exciting. Okay, I'm going to start. This is number 2. And get a few things ready here. This is my favorite method, and I'm going to switch it up here and we'll do some different powders just because it's fun. I'm going to keep, oops, that's the wrong lid.
Does it damage the stamp?
No. Not, if you get it so that it sticks in there, you've got to flake it back out again if it sticks, but it's not going to damage the stamp at all. That's why you want to use the red rubber. The red rubber is, it's melted and poured into the molds when they create it. And the process makes it so that it's a lot more heat resistant than if you use like a clear photopolymer. So they're going to work okay, and they're going to resist the embossing powder. So
Lakshmi says that you're looking amazing and you're loving your clothing style.
Thank you. Well, you know I have to kind of, if you're gonna see me on video, I gotta wear my favorite stuff. So. Okay, so the second method, I'm leaving this one out because I love it. The second method is an acrylic base, okay? And this is where you're going to take a little bit longer because you have to let it dry. When you're using, a lot of people don't realize, and I have some tutorials on my website, some free tutorials, using acrylic to make your embossing powder bubble and create texture. But you can also use it and not have it bubble. So this is just a soft gel. You can really use any acrylic medium that you happen to have handy. This has a little bit more open time than like a matte medium, and it's a little thicker, which I like because it'll hold on to the embossing powder. But you can use whatever you've got handy, but you do want an acrylic base. And you could really use, I mean, you could even use glue. It might bubble a little bit more still. Just make sure you don't use anything flammable. But I'm just gonna get a little bit on and again, you're not gonna be able to see it really well, but I just got a little paintbrush. And this is just a cheapie for because it won't get washed in time. And I'm gonna put a little bit of, just a thin coat, because the thicker you get it, the more likely it's going to be to bubble even after it dries. But if you want it to bubble, fantastic effect, you're gonna heat it wet. But this one, we're gonna let it dry. And so what I'm gonna do is just get an embossing powder, whatever you want that base color to be, and sprinkle it onto that wet medium, and just get that layer done. Okay, and then you're gonna set it aside and let it dry completely. I let mine, the ones that I've got here, I made like 2 weeks ago, and they are totally dry, and they've just been chilling and hanging out, and I mean, that stuff is glued on there, and it's good. So you can make them and use them later. You can make them well in advance, just make a whole bunch if you want. So I have a few that I have already made because you need to set this aside and let it dry. I would say at least overnight. You want it to be no trace of moisture left at all, because that'll keep from having any bubbles when you heat it. Okay, so.
Could you use an acrylic paint as the bottom layer?
Yep, you could. It'll just color it, which could be a really interesting effect. I mean, if you're using a translucent, it could color it. If you're gonna put an opaque embossing powder over it, do whatever you want. If you have a color you hate, that's a great way to get rid of it. So. I am going to go ahead. I've got some of these pre-made ones, and we'll just let's start with one of them. Let's do, I'm gonna do this one. This is a desert clay base. And so I'm gonna get out a few colors that I think will look nice with desert clay. I've got my cinnamon, and you don't want to use translucent to mix in. They'll just disappear. So if you've got a translucent base, that's great. There are a lot of translucent embossing powders out there, but if you're trying to blend colors, once you put a translucent into another one, it just disappears completely. So that doesn't really get you all that much. But let's do, I'll do some cinnamon, and I've got my Turkish bronze, and then I've got my Hebron. This is an antique yellow. So I think those will melt nicely. Got my spoon. Let's pick out a different stamp. And I'm gonna do this one because I want to show, actually no, let's do one of these guys. These are fun. This is from, this is EGL. That first one was EGL 03. This is EGL, I think it's 8. These are my mark making circles is what I call. I have names for all my stamps, but you won't see that on the packaging. So I'm just gonna get my stamp ready like I did before. But now I've got my embossing powder that is dried to that acrylic medium. And that is ready to go. I'm gonna get my tongs to hold that in place. And I'm going to repeat the exact same process that I did before, only I need the actual powder that I started with. That would be helpful. Get my desert clay. And I'm gonna go ahead and heat and just pile it on. And I wanna try and get a little more on this time. Usually I count the layers to make sure I've got enough. So, got my heat gun is all primed and ready, so we're melting more quickly now. Move it aside, sprinkle, sprinkle. I get a little heavy-handed with the sprinkling, which is why I lose a little bit more. Okay, so we've got, that's 3. And you can do more layers than I have done. It just depends on how thick you want it to be. I mean, you could really go and continue to build it up. I usually like to do at least 6 or 7 before I start blending colors. So this is about number 6. And I try to be careful, but it's just easy to spill it. And you know, you can pick up the leftover, and usually in between colors, I clean off the mat and put it all back into the jar. Let me do just one more of this one, and then we'll start to blend. Okay, now I'm gonna hit just a little bit of cinnamon. When you're doing your blending colors, you really don't need very much. You can see how that one's blending in pretty well because the colors match, but it's gonna give it a little reddish tone. And then we'll hit it with a lighter color that'll show up a little better. You don't have to blend them. Again, this is just something that I like to do. Get that a little, and then I'm gonna put a little bit more of the original color on top to knock those back. And keep in mind, embossing powders are gonna mix like paints, especially if you're using translucent embossing powders, because they are dyed. And so you can get some color blending. It's not like they're going to stay separate from each other when you melt them into each other. So you want to make sure, you know, if you put red and green together, you could end up with brown. So you want to keep that in mind. So I've got a stamp ready, center, I'm gonna go in. And you can see how it is pushing it out. Okay, and I'm gonna wait. There we go.
And just a reminder that the embossing powder that we carry is not in the jars like...
Yeah, mine are in jars because these were promo demo ones from the shows. The original ones came in jars, and the company has switched over to more eco-friendly packaging, which I love. I always feel guilty getting rid of these jars because they're too small to recycle. To recycle plastic, it has to be at least the dimensions of a credit card. And so these end up getting tossed. I repurpose them, but you know, when you go through them, you can only use so many jars. So and if you're going to do this technique, I pour them into like a little bowl, a dump bowl or something, and then you can pour them back into the package when you're done. But it makes them cheaper to ship and a lot easier to store, and then they're eco-friendly, which I love. Okay, so you can see I did a little bit better on the backing there, and then peel this off. This is going to have a little more give to it, and I let it dry for a little bit too long, or cool, as I should say. But because it's got the acrylic base, it is still going to be fragile, but it doesn't have quite that same level of bitterness, brittleness. So you can see there's a little bit more give to it. So if you wanted to incorporate this into a project where maybe you wanted to stitch it onto something, while it's still somewhat warm, get your awl or your needle and poke your holes in there where you would want to stitch it. And I'll show you in my class sample here for my next class here at the store how I had stitched one of these on. But go ahead and pop your holes into it. It had some natural holes while it's still a little bit warm. But you can see the difference between this one and the other one. I find that because I've used that acrylic base, they get a little bit thicker. They're a little bit less brittle, and I find it a little easier to work with because you can do a little bit more with them without having them just absolutely shatter. So that is method number 2. Any questions? And most of the ones that I've done here are with that, but you can still see, that one may have been you can still see, I still put the tape on them. If it feels fragile or they crack at all, I throw some tape on it. It's not like any of these are gonna be hanging out where you can see the back side of them. So if that gives it a little bit more stability, then no worries there. So I just throw that embossing powder on there. So that is method number 2. And then I wanted to show how you can create kind of a marbled effect like the ones that I showed at the beginning. So I'll pull out one of these pre-done ones that I've got here. We'll set that aside. And I've got wrought iron. So let's see, what shall we mix with the wrought iron? The wrought iron, let's do Turkish bronze. And I'm gonna do this lapis lazuli, which is a beautiful cobalt blue and gold. And I need more wrought iron, obviously.
Could you use your own stamps carved from Speedy Carve?
Absolutely. Speedy Carve is pretty similar. The deeper the stamps are carved, the better. But you can see some of these are really super detailed, and it does, you know, it does pick it up. But these are a pretty deeply etched rubber stamp. I find though that it's easier to get deep etching when you carve your own. So those will probably, they'll be great. Okay. All right, that will work. For this, it's super simple. You're just gonna need a skewer. But we're gonna start off, it's that same base process. So the wrought iron is meant to look like a really rusted wrought iron, and it's a little bit more matte, and it's got just a hint of kind of a metallic to it. And it's one of my favorite colors, but it does take a little bit more heating to get it completely melted so that it doesn't flake off. And you can even see as you're watching it melt that it looks a little bit different. But it's become one of my absolute favorite ones to work with. Okay. So we'll go ahead and build it up. Okay, 2. And the more you want to swirl, the better it is to have a nice thick base here.
Can you embed them in resins to make jewelry?
You should be able to, yeah. And let's see. And there's something I want to show you. Speaking of embedding, I'm glad you mentioned that because I almost forgot something I wanted to share as a part of this. Okay. I think I'm on like 5. Better to have too many than too few. 6. Now I'm not going to stamp into this one, although you could. Now I'm going to get just a little bit. Got the Kano green. I want to make sure I get some gold in this blue. And then a touch. When I'm doing the marbling, I always like to have a little metallic. Okay, and then I'm going to get that nice and heated and take my skewer and then move that out of the way. And I'm just going to get a skewer or a toothpick and get in there and move it around. That part wasn't totally melted. And if you don't like it, but see, and then I come in here and you hit it with the heat gun and it'll move it around a little bit and really emphasize. And if you don't like how it looks, you can throw a little more on top of it. You know, if it didn't get exactly the effect that you wanted. Reheat and melt it around. Once this dries, you can pop it off the end of your skewer. And then while that is hot, if you wanted to, like I have my boho bits here, they're from the same company. These are the stores from their sale, so I'm not going to actually use them. But if you wanted to take one of the pieces, this one is crystal embers and it's got some carnelian, you could embed them, because when you get your embossing powder that thick, you could embed seed beads, you could embed these little guys into it. The bigger pieces, I embed them, I let them cool, I pop them back out and put some glue in, and then put them back into the cavity that's left behind. But when you get this thick, you can start to put things into it. And the thinner it is, the more it'll just hold on its own. But they are super fun. And this is not, it'll take a little bit longer to cool. And then once it's cool, this is still not totally cool. Yes, my hands are shaking. You can tell I still need to eat breakfast. Once it's cool, you just peel that off. And if you wanted to trim it or something, you could. I love that organic edge to it. The other thing I want to show is that sometimes, let me get a bigger stamp. I want a stamp that's bigger than the seal area, because one of my favorite effects is to have like these where it goes off the edge. This is just something that I personally like. I think it looks really cool that way. So I'm going to now, even though I've peeled that off, I'm going to just reheat this. Oh, before that, let me ink that. You won't see it very well at all.
So with these methods, can you cut them with scissors?
Yep. Cut them while they're wet, while they're warm. If you wait and cut them after they have cooled completely, they'll snap. So if you want to cut them, I'll show you. I had done that with with the first one, but I'll show you again on this one. So I'll make sure I am nice and molten. And then I'm going to get this in so that it kind of goes off the edge. and it's going to squeeze out. I'll pull those out of the way. And I know you can't really see. Okay, and I don't think you need to do this. I just kind of do it because it helps to get it into the details. Also helps me to know when it's cool enough that I can peel it, start to work with it. So you can see what that's going to look like there. And then we'll see if we can peel this guy off. I'm going to try and do it with the block on so that you can see how you would do it if it was a wood mount. And I'm just getting very carefully. Some of the ones that I did, it just peels right off. It's all about how quickly you do it, how many layers you have, the kind of embossing powder you're using. Even within this particular brand, there are differences between the colors, and that's just because of the formulation and you know what's in them, the inclusions that they have. So just be patient with it, work it off. You can't, like I said, you can do it with a wood mount, but I really recommend an unmounted if you can, and then just pop that off. And I just think that is such a cool little piece. It looks like a remnant or a relic of some kind. And then what I would do is I do with stays on, because embossing powder is a thermoplastic polymer, which just means that it is plastic that is formulated to melt at high temperatures and then cool and solidify again when it cools. And that's really all it is. And so you can ink it up, and so it's non-porous because it's plastic. So you would want to use a stays on it, but it's still a little bit warm, and I can say, oh, I don't like that. I can cut it off. But if I take one of these, like this one that I did earlier, that is cooled completely, see how when I try to cut it, it cracks, and just all it's going to do is shatter. So if you want to cut it, do it right away, because especially after you've stamped in it, you can reheat it, but you're going to lose your image. So, but if you do one and you hate it and it looks terrible and you just totally screwed it up, reheat it, remelt it, and stamp again. So that is the embossing powder seals. So let me quickly at least put the lids on these and get them out of the way, because speaking of the seals, I used one in the sample, and the my next class, a part of what I wanted to share today is we're going to show the unrolling of the sample for my wrap and roll class. It's on the 23rd. It's an online live class, and it's with Artistic Artifacts. Oops, throw my stamp across the room. And I'll get this out of the way just because I don't want to get embossing powder on the sample. So I will bring this over here.
Are the details about your class on your website?
They are now, as of last night. The landing page is everything up. All the sample photos are there, and the registration page is also up on Artistic Artifacts. And you can link to it. So here is, and these are just a fun little extra project that I'm going to show you, so I'll talk about them in a minute, but this is the main project. And the idea is that we're going to create wrapped objects and rollable projects, you know, so the entire project can be rolled up. You can do this, I've done it almost entirely in fabric. You could do it in paper if you wanted to. I've got some fat paper mixed into mine, and you can do it in any size. I've given in the supply list the general dimensions for mine.
Is that sari silk ribbon that you've tied it with?
That's just a sari ribbon. And then as you unroll it, you can see that it becomes something that you can hang. If you don't want the sari silk, and then you can see the back side. And I will, part of the classes, I'll talk through and demo a little bit of how I made the back. And then if you want to hang it, then you just loop that up through the back, and then it just hangs like that. And you've got this little fun piece. And so we'll be showing, you can see here, I've used one of the embossing powder seals and I've stitched it on, but you could glue too. If you're doing paper, it won't roll as well, but you could definitely still create something that hangs. And so we're going to make some collaged elements. We're going to make some wrapped and rolled up elements here that we can stitch on. You don't have to stitch them, but you'll at least want to be able to do something that attaches them to whatever your background is. You could try to glue, but these are a little heavy. And then you can, I have handmade my centerpiece here. You can use something pre-made, and that's on the supply list, but I will show you how I stamped with a real leaf that I picked while I was outside and then turned it into a beaded embroidered piece. Then there's some fabric here. So all of the things that I've used are on the supply list. So you can use whatever you want in this center area. You can, and any part of it you can always skip. That's, you know, any of my classes, but we'll make some cool wrapped elements. I'll show you how I made my hand-painted sticks. We'll talk about some alternatives. And one of the alternatives could be even a test tube. So one of the demos I'm gonna do is show you how to do this stamping and painting on glass, because these are my rubber stamps. And there's a different one. And just some fun embellished tops on them. And then this one has some freehand painting on it, but then there is a little rolled journal that goes inside of it. So, and this is just an optional project that I'll show you. And, you know, it doesn't have to be a test tube, they don't have to be glass, but I'll show you how you can do the stamping and painting on a non-porous object. I mean, it could be PVC pipe if you really wanted it to. So, you know, all of my projects are flexible, especially because you're working with whatever you've got in your home studio. But that is the project. And there, oh, this one has embellishments in it, so you can see it doesn't have to be a little journal. If I can get it out. Where's my stick of some kind? Ooh, I do have some tongs. That has then a little wrapped bead from my previous class that they're through there. So just, you know, something fun. I thought about doing this as the centerpiece and became a little obsessed and just turned it into a side project. But I'll do a demo. Part of the class will be a demo on doing the test tubes if you are interested in that as well. So there you go.
I think you've got some people signing up for your class
Yeah,
already.
The registration is open. It's been in the newsletter from Artistic Artifacts. If you're not on the newsletter, make sure you get it, because they have cool stuff and announcements for all of their awesome third Thursday Facebook Live sales. But yeah, that is the embossing powder seals. And then, you know, if you wanted to sew it on there, I showed you how you could just put some holes through it while it's still warm, and that makes it stitchable. This absolutely has masking tape on the back of it. I will tell you that right now, because they're just, you know, it helps to, especially for something where I'm going to roll it up. But the photos are all on there too, and then I've got the supply list with the different types of ideas and some of the sizes for you, what you would need. And yeah, that's it. So any questions or anything before we sign off?
Well, we're not going to sign off just yet, because I'm going to take a walk through the store.
Yes.
Out to the parking lot where we're having our parking lot sale today. So thank you so much, Gwen. For the people who weren't able to watch the whole thing or signed on